This is my Team Associated B44, and I'm going to go over this my setup for this buggy and also just my general thoughts, give a general review of it. I wanted to wait until I had a setup that I was happy with before reviewing this buggy. So, you know, the past 2 weekends at the racetrack, I came in second place in the four-wheel drive event. So I'm very happy with what I have right now for this chassis. So I'll start with the body. I do have the stock body, but I don't use it for racing. I got this J Concepts Illusion body. I do all my painting with spray paint. I don't use an airbrush. I just don't feel like buying one. And I just do relatively simple paint schemes here. So this is just like a metallic black that fades into a darker blue here, and then some flames and stuff. So, you know, nothing too complicated. But this is sort of my new theme now for all of my bodies. So, for example, this is my B4.1 body, kind of the same, right? And the Bulldog I have on my VE8 also the same. So it's a nice new theme. My older bodies were white with red and black flames. But anyway, getting to the setup, one thing about this chassis that actually many four-wheel drive chassis have is the front shock travel tends to be longer than the ride height, and so the front will bottom out a bit. So I just put in like one of my used O-rings there on the shock shaft. I may put in another one just to protect the bottom of the chassis a little more if the suspension bottoms out. But I do have the stock suspension setup in the front in terms of the shock positions on the arm and on the shock tower, the shock collar length, 15 millimeters, and the shock oil and springs and everything. The only difference is I do have the RPM 2-stage shock pistons. I figured I'd try them out just to see how they are, and they work, but I don't notice a significant difference over the stock associated pistons, at least at my track, because the purpose of those pistons is to give you a lighter rebound damping than you have in the compression damping phase. So that works really well if you have a combination of rhythm sections and jumps. My track is mostly jumps and flat surfaces. There are no rhythm sections. So on the track I race at, it doesn't really make a big difference, but you know, they work okay. So the front is basically stock with the exception of the pistons. I don't run a sway bar at the front, but I do at the rear. I used to run the black sway bar, but then I recently changed to the silver one. I noticed everyone at the track, or most of the people at the track who also have a B44 or B44.1, have a silver sway bar. I tried it out. A little bit more steering. You get a little bit more pivoting in the turns. Another major difference is the chassis comes stock with green springs. I switched to the softer black springs. Also, it gives me a bit more rear traction. I use the stock oil, stock shock collar positions, stock shock positions on the shock towers and arms. I do have the 2-stage shock pistons in the rear as well, though, just like the front. But again, the pistons themselves don't seem to make a difference on my track. They may make a difference on your track. I do like running these black springs here. They seem to work quite nicely, at least for my driving style. Let's see. So in terms of suspension, that's pretty much it. For tires, I have in the front Proline M3 Suburbs with the stock inserts. And in the rear, I have AKA Rebar Super Soft with their soft red inserts. The inserts seem to make the biggest difference here. I mean, yes, the Super Soft compound is a bit softer than the soft M3 compound. But you can tell with the stock inserts, like these white foam guys that you get with Proline tires, they're very sort of squishy, and especially along the sidewall of the tire, you get quite a bit of compression here. Now I do cut out the inserts in a way such that they don't ride into the ridge that you mount the tire in. So this area here along the sidewall actually doesn't really have much, if any, insert. It's mostly in the center here. but even in the center, it feels generally softer or more squishy than having the closed cell inserts that you could either get from AKA or Proline. So I just mounted these guys. I just glued them at the front so they still have to dry out, but I have a set of M3 suburbs here with the Proline closed cell blue inserts. They feel firmer, especially along the sidewall, since the inserts are molded to fit these tires, or these kinds of tires. Feels a lot better in the sidewall, so I expect I'll get more side bite, a bit less roll or compression on the tire under a heavy cornering. So can't wait to try these out at the track. Should get better steering response just with the new inserts. But I don't have any religion, so to speak, about tires. So long as they work for me, that's fine. AKA tires are great. Proline tires are great. Some guys on my track use J Concepts and Hot Bodies tires. They all work fine. And in fact, the treads are very similar. Like the Proline suburbs look very, very much like some of the low-C tires. They have almost the exact same tread design. Hot Bodies, J Concepts, you all have almost the exact same tread design for these kinds of suburbs type of tires. So that's not going to really change as you go from brand to brand. Just the compound and the type of insert you have will make the biggest difference. And in fact, the fastest guy at the track, who owns the track, he races practically bald tires and he still kicks everyone's butt. So, you know, tires make some difference, but the skill, the driver skill and practice make an even bigger difference there. So enough about tires. You'll notice here I mounted a little Lexan piece here. It's just to cover the spur gear because the spur gear is exposed. So I just wanted to make sure that when I mount the battery and connect it, that the battery wires don't rub up against or grind up against the spur gear when the motor's running. So just had some scrap Lexan and I bent this and you know, punch some holes in it with the screws that go through the upper deck just to mount this. It weighs practically nothing, so it's worth doing if you have some spare Lexan lying around. I tend to mount all of my wires running over the top chassis plate. A lot of the people that I race against mount wires under the top chassis plate, and if you look at like professional drivers and their setup, they're also mounting under it, presumably to save a little bit more wire length and therefore saving weight. But seriously, you're not going to notice a difference. The difference in wire length is incredibly small if you go over or under. And at least if you go over, you don't risk rubbing the wire up against the center drive shaft. So, you know, some people do go a little too far with trying to save weight or be aesthetically appropriate. I think that's just kind of stupid to do that. The slipper clutch here, I have it set pretty tight, kind of hard to see. But that's because I had replaced the slipper pads because the original ones wore out, and the replacement ones are just like what you get in a B4 or a T4. They're the orange standard pads. And I noticed I was getting quite a bit of slippage with the stock slipper clutch setting, so I just set it really tight, so I actually don't get very much slippage at all. Doesn't seem to affect the diffs, though. You know, I haven't had to rebuild these diffs pretty much since I built the chassis, and I've been running this, racing it for about 3 months now. I do have both the front and rear diffs set to approximately 3/8 of a turn away from full lock. I had previously been running the front looser than the rear to get a little bit more steering, but I wasn't getting a whole lot of punch coming out of turns as the diff was slipping, so I just tightened those up a bit. So 3/8 of a turn away from full lock, front and rear, seems to work great. Let's see, what else? Cool thing about this chassis is that the front and rear gearboxes are exactly the same. They're the exact same part number. So if you break one, you could, you know, you only need to bring one gearbox with you, a spare gearbox if you need to replace anything. So that's very nice about this chassis, and it's a very simple chassis once you put it together, which makes it really easy to work on. And it's lightweight, it's incredibly fast, handles great. The only parts that I've broken were, I think one of the rear hub carriers broke, so I got some RPM hub carriers for the rear. I'm pretty sure, I don't remember. And in the front, I've broken tons of front suspension arms, especially as I was learning how to race and learning how to not crash going over jumps. But these suspension arms are very, very easy to replace. You just take out these 2 screws here, and then the screw holding in the hinge pin on the front brace for the inside of the suspension arm, and then on the outside there's a screw holding in the hinge pin for the hub carrier at the front, and then the screw holding in the shock. So it's 5 screws. Suspension arm comes out, put in a new one, put it all together. If you're quick with a screwdriver, you should be able to replace these arms in 1 or 2 minutes. So it's a really easy fix. I've also broken the shock caps a couple times, but that's not a big deal. I had thought about getting aluminum shock caps like these guys here. Associated does make those. This I'm just going to put in some kind of a basher chassis, because the aluminum caps, they're nice to go in some kind of casual running chassis, but for racing I don't think they're very useful, because although they won't break, or it's harder to break them, all that means is that if there is a force that would otherwise break a plastic shock cap and you have metal there, it just transfers the force into something else, and in this case it transfers to the shock tower. So a replacement shock tower is around $10 or $15, but shock caps you can get 4 for $2, $3, something like that. And so, you know, keep the plastic ones. They're also lighter. The B44 does ship with the version 1 shocks, so you don't screw in the O-ring seals from the bottom. You have to clip them in from the top, and they have there's no bleeder hole in the version 1 shock cap. So I just got the version 2 shock caps with the bleeder hole. Makes it a lot easier to get the oil in and make sure your damping is right. But version 1 shocks, I've worked with those for a while. They work fine. You know, there's no big deal working on them and rebuilding them. So that's, you know, the main difference between the B44 and the 44.1 is the version 1 caps. 2mm carbon fiber instead of 3mm in the 44.1. And the motor mount here is, in the 44.1 is a cam type motor mount. Here it's just a conventional motor mount. And this is probably the hardest thing about this chassis, because the screw that holds in the motor on the bottom is blocked by the battery mount post. So to get to the screw, you need an L-shaped hex driver, or a hex driver with a ball end. And even then, it's a little bit hard to get in there and tighten that screw. So that's the only thing I'm not too crazy about in this chassis, but I don't feel like spending $40 on a cam type motor mount. So just make sure you pick the right pinion gear for your track and your application, and, you know, mount the motor once so that you don't have to worry about taking it out and remeshing the gears and everything, and that should be fine. Let's see, in terms of electronics, I have a Novak 6.5 turn ballistic, works great. A Spectrum SR300 receiver, AM BRC transponder. I have high-tech high-speed steering servo. I forgot the actual model number. Let me see if I can get that here. That's the 7940TH, same thing I run on my B4.1. Excellent servo. I used to run a Novak Havoc here, and then that kind of got glitchy, and I had to get rid of it. Now we run an Orion Vortex R10 Pro. Fantastic speed control, really powerful brakes. Very, very excellent speed control. Haven't had any problems with it whatsoever. On the whole, I love this chassis. This is my favorite chassis to go racing with, because, to be honest, I'm the most competitive with this chassis presently compared to my other chassis, and it's just so easy to drive, really fast. It's easy to work on. It's a wonderful, very satisfying chassis to drive. So they don't make the B44 anymore. You got to get the 44.1 if you want to buy it retail. But, you know, go on eBay and see if you can find a used B44. They perform exactly the same as B44.1, and there are just some aesthetic differences, like, you know, chassis plates, the shocks, the motor mount, but otherwise they are literally exactly the same. So better value if you get the B44, especially if you can get it used or something, be a lot cheaper. So that's it for the B44. Excellent, excellent chassis.